Welcome. My name is Dan Harradine and I am the lead partner for infrastructure, government and healthcare for KPMG in Queensland, and I'm joined here today by three colleagues who are subject matter experts in the area of the future of work. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge both the traditional owners of the land upon which we are meeting today in undertaking this panel, and also the traditional owners of the land where you may be as part of this virtual summit, and particularly the greater Whitsunday region as well. It's a real pleasure for KPMG to be involved in this project and in this virtual summit. As a professional services firm, we have a real interest in the future of work, the transformation of regions and the development of both Queensland and Australia more generally. And we do undertake a large body of work with clients and also in terms of thought leadership as well on this topic. The Greater Whitsunday Alliance has engaged KPMG to support its future blueprint for employment, and part of our discussion today will focus on that. Part of our discussion today will draw upon three of my colleagues who are subject matter experts who've either been involved in that work or more broadly with clients as well. So we appreciate the opportunity to be here, and before we start I might just introduce the panel briefly. So Amanda.
Hi, Amanda Goddard. I am an Associate Director at KPMG and I have a specific focus on innovation and technology in food and agriculture as well as circular economy. My day-to-day, I'm very lucky to get to work with growers and producers as well as industry bodies, universities and government in the space of food and agriculture, and it's been a pleasure working on this project.
Great, thank you. Brandon?
Hi, Brandon Archibald. I lead our education sector in Queensland. So that spans right from the schooling sector through to tertiary education. I've got a real passion in terms of improving the education and skills outcomes for all Australians, and have deep expertise in a Queensland context in terms of doing a number of jobs, whether that be from lifelong learning through to broader vocational education and skilling in the region.
Great, thank you. And Michelle?
Michelle Balderstone. So I'm the Project Director leading the piece of work that we're doing with the Greater Whitsunday Alliance on the Future Employment Blueprint. My real passion is on workforce planning and with a focus on future of work. I work across both state, federal and local governments, and it's been a real pleasure to do this work.
That's great, thank you. So before we start, I think I'll just make the observation that yes, I touched on the fact, as you did Michelle, that we're undertaking this piece of work with the Alliance. It's also useful, I touched on the fact that we are a global professional services firm, but all three of us are locally based. We work extensively with both local organisations, be they businesses, not-for-profits, and also in my role as Queensland Government lead partner, as do each of you, work extensively with the Queensland Government and local governments. And so it's a real privilege to be here and have the opportunity to talk about the future of work. But in addition to that, it's also close to home for each of us in terms of having been through some of the impacts of COVID and other things, and being in a position to contribute to both regional development, to contribute to the region and to contribute to outcomes in a broader Queensland context. So we really appreciate the opportunity and commend the Alliance for the work that's been commenced. And with that, we might jump into the questions for the panel. In that regard, clearly the future of work means a lot of things to a lot of people. KPMG has been publishing material over the course of the last 3 or 4 years about the changing nature of the workforce, skills, employment, what does that look like, and the rapidity of that change and how much movement there actually is. We clearly work in this space across a range of industries, as you've heard already, and as part of that process we also undertake quite a bit of research. So biennially we undertake research with some of Australia's leading chief executives and others. We are due to release some of that research in the not too distant future. The most recent piece that we looked at was in 2018, and as part of that we know that across Australia 86% of CEOs are actively looking at the future of their workforce, the skills that are required and the changes and the speed with which those changes are coming through. So there are clearly differences in what it means when you talk about the future of work. There are clearly differences of opinion about the topics and the areas of expertise. Each of you has a bit of a different perspective on that. So Michelle, we might start with you if you want to talk to us a little bit in the context of what does the future of work mean in the work that you do and the clients that you engage with particularly in the context of the Greater Whitsundays Alliance and the work that we've been undertaking.
Yep. I mean, we do tend to find that future of work carries with it both a lot of hype and a lot of fear. And I think there is a need to kind of change that narrative. We do hear that CEOs are aware that future of work is something they need to address, but they actually don't know how to address it. And I think something like future of work, we need to almost change the narrative to make it much more simple to understand the next step. And even if we talk about something as simple as there needs to be a technology journey and adoption pathway that someone's going to undertake, and with that comes a lot of workforce reform and a lot of change that's going to happen to roles and functions. That seems to make it a lot less scary than talking about future of work. So I think there is a need to kind of change that to help people take the next step.
I guess one of the things that we hear quite often is, to your point about fear, future of work means automation. It means, things like universal basic income because robots will take over and I won't have a role. Through the work you've done, I think, and the research we undertake, it's very clear that that's not, the be-all and end-all. There is an end of that spectrum for certain industries potentially and sectors, but that's a long way away yet. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's right. So although there will be a level of job automation that is predicted for certain roles, I think that's both a lot less than people first expect. And I think the way to think of it also is, it might be reducing the growth in the employment of that occupation rather than it necessarily taking away jobs immediately that are there. The other thing is that there will be a lot of augmentation where technology will work alongside us humans and change the way in which we do things, but it won't necessarily replace what we do. And that's where we see the bulk of, I think, the change ahead of us. And the third part is that it will create demand for new roles and new occupations, particularly ICT related ones, but also others, around things like cybersecurity. So there are new opportunities in this as well. It's not all a negative story.
Okay, that's good. You touched on technology, and Amanda, I might come to you in the context particularly of agriculture and so on, and that kind of changing dynamic around differences of roles rather than just one end of the spectrum. In a technology space, what are we seeing in the areas that you work?
Yeah, it's really interesting in agriculture because there are many different sectors within agriculture and they can't all be treated the same. And you hear about agriculture, it's the lowest level of tech adoption of any industry, but that does vary depending on the sector. So cottons, livestock, they're a little bit more advanced or much more advanced than things like horticulture, for instance. And part of that comes down to the type of people that can grow or produce in those sectors. So, it's the adage of anyone can grow a vegetable, and that means there are very different levels of sophistication and very different levels of types of jobs that exist there. But we are seeing that there's an increased focus on data scientists, there's an increased focus on people able to do the robotics and automation, but that's not going to change the industry employment levels dramatically, and definitely not straight away. It might change the manual labour, but there'll be a big part of the role of technology in agriculture is how does it support better decision making? How does it support people to do the value adding stuff and not the things that take their time away from doing that?
Yep. So. Okay, that's really useful. And Brendan, from an education perspective and then more broadly, I guess, if we make it a little bit more personal perhaps or close to home, if you think about it in the context of small to medium-sized enterprises, the kind of changes in skill requirements and things you're seeing, what kind of advice and guidance have you been providing, or what have you been seeing kind of happening out there across that SME space in particular?
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, we're seeing a real divide between probably the larger businesses that are being a bit slower to adapt to technology changes and the implications of that for their workforce, and some of the small, more agile businesses that are maybe a bit more tech savvy, that can be more adaptive and flexible to technology changes. I think in terms of when we're doing work with these smaller businesses, we're thinking about it from three perspectives. It's very much about looking outward, understanding your market, understanding the competitive landscape in terms of what they're doing around the technology space, and then starting to map that back and say, well, what capabilities do we need as a business to respond to those changing trends, and then addressing and thinking about the gaps and developing a particular workforce plan to bridge those gaps.
It's so interesting listening because you would flip that for agriculture. So the small businesses, they're agile, but the buying decision for technology is really difficult, whereas a larger business can invest in the innovation, they can buy the technology and they can move forward a bit faster. So you'd flip it for sure.
Yeah. It would be remiss of us, obviously, given where we are globally at the moment, to not talk about COVID. Clearly, COVID has unknown consequences that are still to come. You know, we have been through a period of rapid change that has impacted large business, small business and community and society as a whole. One of the things we all hear about is this view of how do we kind of pick the eyes out of the bits that have been successful and useful, things that have worked, and then how do we try not to return to the ways that didn't work in the past. Some of that will be easier to do than others because it's easier to leave some things in the past. At the same time, some of those things may challenge us as we move forward in terms of how do we actively want to work across a business community or across government even into the future. So from that perspective, I mean, again, we come back maybe and start with you, Amanda, into an ag tech space and an agriculture space more generally. If you think about the different impacts across the regional focus versus what might be more of a rural or remote, and then into kind of, you know, something that might be more metropolitan, what have you seen in that agriculture space?
From a COVID stance, it's interesting. We were talking the other day with our global head of ag, and his view was at the end of the day, everyone's going to look at COVID as a food safety issue. So that is going to cause quite a bit of change. And in terms of how do you digitally have a footprint for food assurance, which is basically paper at the moment. So that's one view of COVID. It obviously has flow-on impacts to logistics, it has flow-on impacts to the pack houses, to feedlots, to everything, but it has driven different demand levels for produce, different ability to access export markets, so that impacts, you know, what happens at the port, what happens at the region.
We did hear actually in our consultation with those in Greater Whitsunday that they have a heavy reliance on 457 visas in agriculture and in other sectors as well. And part of the challenge for that is if we're not getting people on 457 visas coming in, what does that now mean in terms of maybe the way in which we've previously employed workforce in sectors like that? How do we get Australian-based workers to move into those industry sectors? And part of the other challenge there is, in fact, some other, like the impact of policy decisions like JobKeeper and JobSeeker as well on that we definitely heard.
Yeah, influencing the financial incentive to be in the industry. Yeah.
Okay. And Michelle, you touched on it before, but in terms of planning, I mean, I imagine we would often say that planning is important and thinking about the future, but how do you go about that planning, and how important is it in the construct of a time period when you have COVID? Many unknowns that clearly won't be defined for a little while yet. Things like policy positions changing, JobSeeker, JobKeeper, more generally, what is the economic environment, what does that mean? So in that sense, you touched on planning, but how important is planning at the moment, and what kind of workforce planning do you think businesses in particular, but also governments and others should be doing, or have you seen are doing at the moment?
Yeah. Look, I think now is a really great time to be thinking about whether you call it workforce planning, whether you call it labour market analytics, whether you call it kind of a jobs focus. COVID has given us, I guess, the opportunity to say what doesn't work and what can we do better and how can we rebuild this in a better way. And I guess the important thing to flag really is we've got COVID happening, and then on top of that we've got this real push for jobs obviously going forward, and that alignment of kind of skilling and jobs. You've got regional development and regional innovation being a key focus, and then future of work. So those are kind of four things that are all kind of happening, and there's an interplay of that at the moment for any kind of workforce planning, and all of it should really be considered together to really help think about, well, what should the future look like? Because if we just only think about jobs and alignment to jobs now and not to the jobs of the future, we run the risk that we're training people for jobs that don't exist. And so to really set regions up like the Whitsunday region for the future, I think there needs to be consideration of all those four things and the impact that they have, and they're actually really different on each industry. So tourism, we've definitely heard has been heavily hit by COVID, and I think will continue to be, as it's reliant on kind of flights into the region and an international market with borders closed. So every industry will have different things that are really happening for them at the moment in terms of COVID, in terms of skilling, in terms of workforce and pipeline, and then also in terms of future of work. So yeah, I think it's exciting times if we do it the right way.
Yep. And you've touched on pipeline. I mean, 457 visas is one part of that pipeline, but that restriction in migration, that restriction more generally in terms of cross-border, even within Australia, let alone, not just international, clearly does present a challenge. So, I think to your point, the ability to rapidly change that plan that says, well, we may have been reliant on one or two sources. If those sources aren't available, there is a need clearly to start thinking differently about how will we fulfil our workforce needs, what does that plan look like, and how do we do that? And that, again, will differ depending on sector, but at the same time will be required regardless of sector, I think. So I think your point about that analytics, whether it's the forward planning in a kind of more traditional way or in a new way of what are the requirements of the roles and what kind of skills do we need, I think they're very relevant. So, yeah. Okay. One of the observations, and this is a hybrid comment I would make about both COVID and the fact, economically where we are at the moment as a society, even before COVID, we had seen a situation where we'd started to see a little bit of a downturn in the economy. That's not a criticism because it's kind of to be expected. Australia had the most prosperous period of economic growth of any Western country, 27 years of continuous growth since our kind of last actual recession. It's a phenomenal period of growth. For anyone that can remember back to that period, we were in a situation where there was absolute focus at that time on employment and jobs. We have returned to that a little bit in terms of if you hear the Prime Minister talking about, policy agenda number one being jobs. You hear the Premier and the state government indeed talking the same way, boosting employment opportunities, boosting business opportunities, thinking about infrastructure spend and other economic stimuli to support growth of jobs, employment and economic prosperity. Michelle, I'd probably ask you, in terms of some of those predictive models about thinking into the future, thinking about what employment opportunities look like, can you touch on some of those, what we see and what they say?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess, as I mentioned before, some of those predictive models have, I think, created a sense of fear and job loss going forward. And we do really need to change that. But I think, it really does challenge the way in which we've probably thought about workforce and we need to be really moving to how do we support kind of a skilling of people who might be more mature age into new industry sectors and new occupations. There has historically been a real focus on, skilling people as they're, younger, so they're 18 to 22-year-olds kind of coming through into industry sectors. And I think, we need to change some of that kind of perception around where education and skilling applies and lifelong learning, which I know, Brandon, you would also be able to talk to. I think, we do need to also change some of our perception of what those jobs look like that are maybe that first step into employment, those youth jobs. So they might historically have been or maybe even continue to be in things like retail, but going forward that might really change. So we might be looking at, seeing that first step into the labour market, maybe even being something like a digital desktop support kind of role or in completely new and different occupations that we don't think about now. And it may even give recognition, as we talked about before, for some of those roles where currently we rely on people with 457 visas or overseas trained people, and really there might be job opportunities in areas like agriculture or transport and logistics as that first step and first rung that we haven't traditionally looked at.
And from a specific kind of sectoral perspective, Amanda, Brendan, what are we seeing in that space in terms of those changes to roles and job replacement? Is that the type of thing that you see universities and education providers planning for, or do you see it as a kind of a gradual discussion about moving in different directions? And is that the right way? Is that what you would think about from a regional perspective for some in an area like the Greater Whitsundays? What do you see as the kind of future of that education sector space?
Look, I think providers are absolutely focused on that, but I think certainly we've seen in the last few years a heightened focus on regions and what you specifically need, and I think that has great applicability to the Greater Whitsundays area. Across the work we've been doing, we're seeing an increased demand for digital type skills, and whether that's use of technology or broader application in businesses to improve performance. I wouldn't say necessarily brand new roles, but we're definitely seeing an increased demand kind of through the COVID environment for things like call center workers, general technology type roles, and some of that's getting into the new areas of automation, cyber, blockchain, artificial intelligence, and then even into some of the more traditional areas. So we're obviously seeing an increase in kind of the supermarket space, and even accountants. So the need to respond to the federal government support packages, and how we then enable businesses to access those financial supports.
And I think from an agriculture perspective, similar styles of technology influence, so demand for data scientists, AI, cognitive learning, people who are building those platforms to gather the data off the land and be able to push it through the whole supply chain is a real skill set needed. The cyber security, blockchain again. But beyond the digital and the app creation and things like that, it's people who are able to understand the impact of climate change and sustainability of the land, so enabling resilience through the industry. And so there's definitely been an increase in interest in that at a university level. From an education perspective, connecting with agriculture, the ones that do it best are where the industry and, say, the TAFE connect and talk about what are the skill sets this employer needs in a region to drive a future workforce for them and for the community. And that's driving this local workforce and the lifelong learner kind of view. The emergence of micro-credentials, I think, will come out a little bit more in agriculture as well. And there's also these basic levels of farm safety certifications, which will always exist, but are starting to move into an online platform rather than having to be on farm doing that. And that helps in terms of if you're a producer or a grower, you're getting someone who's already got that and proven their credential, and you're not having to take that risk on farm and the time in training them on farm. So little tweaks like that will happen and continue to happen, I think.
Brandon, in particular, I'm interested at a kind of provider level. If you think about, the things we've heard publicly, particularly universities and vet sector, the impact of international students not being able to be here, the impact of income loss, what that means, and if we focus in terms of into that provider space, there's clearly some change coming, and it's been coming pre-COVID, but it's probably been hastened with COVID in terms of what those service providers are delivering and how that works. Online learning became very rapid. Traditionally, we've seen many of our institutions really talking about the benefits of networking, being face-to-face, and even having courses that are designed to give you global connections because you can travel to certain places and vice versa. And we've had this rapid change to the way things are delivered, and even in terms of, we've touched on micro-credentialing even, but what are you seeing specifically in that kind of service provider space about how things change and the different types of learning, skill development and courses that exist?
Yeah, I think you're right, Dan. There's been a bit of a resistance to change probably in recent times, and a tendency to lean more towards traditional approaches, but we are seeing a couple of particular focus areas that providers are starting to embrace. One of those is micro-credentialing and short courses. We've seen the federal government respond to that in recent times in terms of the way that the funding system is geared towards supporting those micro-credentials. Another area is absolutely the increased focus on online and blended learning. So no longer is there a requirement for students to come on campus and study for the full term, but they can really interact at key points when as and when required. That obviously has implications for vet providers and universities in terms of the way that they structure their physical campuses as well. Michelle touched on it recently, but we've been doing a bit of work in the space of lifelong learning. Really interesting space, and I think some of the key findings out of that really highlighted the notion of, from an individual's perspective, that it really comes down to a kind of a mindset and a culture of lifelong learning. And I think businesses and policy makers need to kind of adapt that kind of notion towards lifelong learning, and think that it's going to be about acquiring skills throughout your life. You're going to be upskilling or reskilling into new areas. And I think providers are catching on to that and then thinking about, well, what are those kind of post-grad type offerings that we need to do to respond to the market.
Okay. And I think, you've touched on it as well, but on the employer side, as you say, there's different requirements from a service provider perspective about how often you can touch with formal learning or lifelong learning, even if it's informal. That will clearly create some changes for employers, whether that be business, government or otherwise as well. So, Michelle, from a workforce perspective, what kind of demands are you seeing from an employment perspective and from an employer's perspective in particular that are driving some of those changes?
So I think of three key things out of that. One is a real push for contemporary skills and skilling, and employers really want to training of their staff in the absolute latest of things, whether that be to do with cybersecurity or things like that. They absolutely want cutting edge, and I think what we're hearing is that sometimes education and training providers are unable to keep pace with that. And I think then linked to that, so the second thing is that I think we're hearing from employers that they want the training to be delivered not necessarily through formal qualifications anymore. It may be delivered in-house. And then I think it also links to the third thing that we're seeing, which is greater recognition from employers that what they need in terms of skilling and skill sets is the embedding of that in people's practice. So instead of just having a L&D budget where someone goes and does a course but then they don't apply any of that in their practice, that there's greater recognition that they might need supervision or education roles where they're able to, continually reflect maybe on their practice or ensure that they're actually embedding capabilities in practice so that it's not a wasted investment.
Yeah, and it's very different, as we've just heard across both of those, to the kind of, what you might describe as traditional way of either finish school and go and attain a trade, or alternatively finish school, go to university, get your qualification and then go to the workforce and maybe think in the future about postgraduate and do an MBA or do something else down the track. This is that constancy of learning, the change to, a learning mindset and that lifelong learning that you've spoken about, Brandon. And Amanda, in the sense of, again, coming back maybe very specifically to agriculture, those types of skills, you've touched on them before into some of the data science, but what in your discussions with employers are you seeing pulled through?
I think the other thing that's really coming through is and it's always been there, but that demand for middle management. So HR skills, accounting skills, just some of those basic things that are quite hard to get to a region. And when you think about the owners of the properties and the people who are running these businesses, they are getting their education through industry conferences or events, but there's no qualification attached to that. They're getting it through talking to others, but if they had the ability to do a short course that gave them an extra qualification and put them on a pathway for something even bigger and better with business literacy or with change management skills or leadership skills, I think that would be really appreciated. It comes back to that sophistication of business and the type of business and the industry they're in and what they get access to, and they get things through the industry bodies, but a lot of it is that connection with others in their region, and it is hands-on learning. But if there was an option for something a little bit more formal, I think that would be really appreciated. But it's the manual labour all the way through to the business owner, and there's all different skill sets needed. I think there'll be a growing need for some soft skills. And then, of course, as I mentioned, the digital, that's the move of ag tech into farms to help make decisions on farm can only happen if you've got someone to collect it, to analyse it and to interpret it, and there is a real lack of that in the industry.
Okay.
And just building on that, Amanda, I think we are seeing a change in some of the national training products. So hopefully in kind of 6 to 12 months from now, when you do kind of a business qualification, you'll be able to get those base enterprise skills that you touched on, but you can then also specialise in a technical area, and I think that's going to have great applicability for all sectors.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay. So we started at the outset in particular referencing that KPMG's been doing some work with the Greater Whitsundays Alliance, and Michelle, you're the Program Director for that piece of work and have been working closely with GW3. We've purposefully tried to keep this at a higher level than that work, but it would be remiss of us to not probably touch on some of the really local elements to that. And I know it's preliminary, I know we haven't finalised that work yet, but I also know you've been talking to a number of local businesses and also, the touch points within government as well, at local government and state government levels here as part of the region. So it might be useful if you just want to touch on, where we're up to in that piece of work, what that future employment blueprint may look like. Not trying to preempt where we get to, because as I say, it's not complete yet, but some of those insights, I think, just to round us out would be useful for people.
Yep. So I think we've seen some really great things in the discussion that we've had with people in the region, and I'd probably want to call out three key things. One is that, we've seen a lot of trials already starting to happen within the region where people are using emerging technologies, and they're really exciting stories. So, a health example of that is there is the telehealth optometry trial that Mackay HHS are leading across the state, and I think that's a really interesting story. We've heard from Tassel, who's a prawn grower within the region, about how they're using the latest technologies and really applying what they've learnt in their salmon farming in Tasmania and really bringing that into the region in their prawn farming. And there's many other examples that we've heard across, mining, agriculture, health as well. So that's really exciting to hear. I mean, one of the key things at the moment, obviously, for something like the tourism sector is that they are continually seeking to adapt new technologies and make their products really as accessible as they can, obviously, to all consumers. But we definitely heard in terms of tourism that COVID has hit them pretty dramatically at the moment. The second key thing that I think is really exciting for the region is that there's a lot of focus on regional development and creating a regional hub within Mackay. And a key example of that happening is the Resources Centre of Excellence that's been set up for mining and mets. And a lot of investment really in trying to look at future skilling and how can we, really create that kind of hub environment there with, the Isaac LGA being, our key kind of mining area within Queensland, and really trying to pull that together and keep that within the region as much as possible. So it's really exciting to hear plans around innovation and really trying to build the region up there. Another example, I talked about Tassel before, but they have real plans to actually make the prawn farming that they're doing within the region the biggest in Australia. So, there are really big plans, I think, for the region, which are exciting to hear. The third thing, though, I would say that has come out of consultation is that there is a real push for people to say we do need the skilling, we do need the education and training that sits within the region. And I think, across a lot of the consultation that we've heard, we have heard people say, look, people when they're straight out of school, they don't necessarily stay within the region, and we do need people to stay. We need people to go to universities, to go to TAFEs, to undertake their apprenticeship, or even to work with employers and be trained up so that they're staying here and not leaving and not coming back. So that has been a key focus of the discussion as well, and I think there is a strong desire in the region to really help build skilling.
Great. All right. Well, I think we've covered a diverse range of topics there, and clearly that's relevant in the context of the future of work, because there is no single answer or antidote in terms of where we will be and what that will look like. It's clearly an exciting area of both study, rigour, research and work more generally. And I think in closing, I think we'd just all of us like to commend the Greater Whitsunday Alliance for the work that they've commissioned and have started to really kind of put the region on the map from a future of workforce perspective and thinking about that blueprint. So I know there's plenty of material on the website. I know that we are one of a number of presentations and panel discussions and so on. So I'll close it out there and say thank you for the opportunity, and we look forward to finishing that piece of work with the Alliance and continuing to see the growth of the region and the plans for the workforce of the future in Greater Whitsundays.